This is the old Scottish Parliament building in Edinburgh. It's where Scottish MPs sat until 1707, when, with the Act of Union, they voted to form a united kingdom with England. From then on, Scottish MPs represented their constituencies in Westminster. But the old order is under threat, and maybe the UK, as it exists today, will, in a few years' time, have been consigned to the dustbin of history. That's certainly the aim of the country's ruling Scottish Nationalist Party, the SNP. Interestingly though, while the SNP came to power in 2011 with a resounding 45.4% of the popular vote, opinion polls often show that far less than that actually want full independence. That could easily change though, and while the issue clearly arouses passions, this lonely sticker was the only one I saw in favour of independence in a week of travelling around the country. If the SNP have their way, Scots will vote on independence in autumn of 2014. Or rather, residents of Scotland will vote on the issue. So, if you're Scottish and live in England, you won't be able to vote, but if you're English and live in Scotland, you will. Likewise, if you're Bulgarian or Portuguese or Estonian or a citizen of any other EU country, but you live in Scotland, you'll also be able to vote. Since 1998, many powers have been devolved, as they say, back to Scotland. That means that it has its own parliament and government again. The Scottish Parliament has some powers to vary tax levels, although it's never done that, but most day-to-day administration is in Scottish hands. Big exceptions are foreign affairs and defence. Much of Scotland is very beautiful, but there are not many people here. The UK has a population of more than 62 million, but only 5.2 million of them live in Scotland. That's far less than London alone. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have their own parliaments, but England does not. Anomalies in the way the UK has evolved, especially with regard to Scotland, explain why opinion polls show that more people in England are in favour of Scottish independence than Scots. A student from London, say, going to university in Scotland, has to pay the same as they would in England, Wales or Northern Ireland, which from this year will be roughly £9,000 a year in tuition fees, but for residents of Scotland and for the rest of the EU who come to Scotland, tuition is free. Of course, a lot of the argument comes down to money and how Scotland and the rest of the UK choose to spend it. Much of Scotland's wealth lies offshore. If Scotland becomes independent, and England does not dispute the maritime boundary line, then 95% of the UK's oil will remain in Scotland. Places like Aberdeen, which supply the rigs and oil industry, have very low rates of unemployment. Scotland is estimated to have some 16 to 23 billion barrels of oil left, but how much that would actually bring Scotland depends, of course, on the price of oil. A big issue in the debate has centred on the fate of the Royal Bank of Scotland, which had to be saved by the British government when it teetered on the brink of collapse in 2008. Opponents of independence say that this is a good example of why Scotland should remain within the UK. Those who support independence say it was so big and that the impact of a collapse would have been so devastating to the whole of Britain that the authorities in London would still have had to rescue it, even if Scotland had been independent. Today, the SNP say that if Scotland leaves the UK, it would retain the monarchy and the pound. It has long had its own banknotes, but they're the same as any other British pound. The announcement of a Scottish referendum has brought lots of foreign interest to Scotland. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot here that's very, very British. Looks like a London taxi? Yes, it does. But we're in Edinburgh. This is the main war memorial in Glasgow, Scotland's biggest city. Indeed, there are monuments to and reminders of Scottish military prowess across the country. This is a typical war memorial from the days of the British Empire, in which the Scots played a leading role. And this is a painting at the Museum of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Regiment, commemorating their famous Thin Red Line at the 1854 Battle of Balaclava in Crimea at which they stood firm and defeated a Russian cavalry charge. The Regimental Museum is in Stirling Castle, once the home of Scotland's kings and queens. The military played a great role in forging a sense of Britishness, but now that's fading. And pride in Scottishness is returning. You can see it everywhere, from kitschy shops selling kilts and assorted tartanry, as the Scots say, to books. And there are plenty of books being published about every aspect of Scottish life and history. And Scottish pride extends even to supermarkets. Tesco is one of Britain's biggest retailers, but I've never seen it try to sell me something based on the taste of England. Scotland's museums are also riding a wave of pride in Scottishness. The National Museum in Edinburgh has recently been revamped. Here it celebrates Scottish scientists who kicked off the Industrial Revolution, invented television and, more recently, gave birth to Dolly the Scottish sheep, the world's first cloned mammal. The Scottish National Portrait Gallery has just reopened too after a major refurbishment. The crowded frieze commemorates Scots from the Stone Age to 1889 when the museum opened. Today, the field of Bannockburn near Stirling can be pretty bleak of a winter's day with lashing rain, but in June 2014, so a couple of months before the probable referendum, there'll be celebrations here to mark the 700th anniversary of Robert the Bruce's crushing defeat of the English here. But will all this pride in Scottishness be enough to sway Scots to vote for an independent country? For many people, their first question's going to be, will I be better or worse off? Many of Scotland's industries should not really be affected by independence. Tourists will still come to see the sights and look for the Loch Ness Monster, and they'll still need to be reminded to drive on the right, not the wrong side of the road. Today, the whisky business is booming. This is the Glenmurray distillery in Elgin, in Murray, in the northeast. Whisky's a big earner for Scotland and Britain, and business is good, thanks especially to soaring demand from countries like India, China and Russia, where it's seen as classy to be drinking Scotch. So independence should not really affect the business, which has to invest for the long term. But Murray is also home to two big military bases, Lossiemouth and Kinloss. They were recently threatened with closure, but a local campaign, spearheaded by the Northern Scot, the local newspaper, whose editor is Mike Collins, helped to save them, at least for now. Many local jobs depend on the bases, and so if Scotland left the UK, then there might be no British military here either. No one knows for sure, but this will be a factor in the way people vote. The SNP say British troops will be replaced by a Scottish Defence Force. Mike Collins told me that, in Murray, the independence debate has not really caught fire yet. But it will, and if Scotland leaves the UK, all the consulates in Edinburgh, and all major countries are represented here, will turn into embassies. This is the Russian consulate. But, and it's a big but, many who are debating these issues over a pint in famous Edinburgh watering holes like Sandy Bells think that Scots will opt for something just short of independence, which is to say some form of enhanced devolution or autonomy. Whether England and the rest of the UK accept that, though, is another question. But until Scots vote, we'll just have to wait and see. For the Pulitzer Centre, I'm Tim Judah in Scotland.